and become little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whosoever shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. But whosoever shall offend one of these little children which believeth in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck and that he drown in the depth of the sea. That is what Mark and Luke say. Thus, under our moral code, our moral laws, children are innocent and humble, and it is a sin to mistreat them. What do God's written laws or words say about human beings? We're all here human beings. Quote, we are the clay and thou, God, art potter, and we are all of the work of thy hand. Isaiah 64:8. Malachi 2:10 says, have we not all one Father? Hath not God created us? And Romans 8:16 through 17 reminds us, quote, we are all the children of God, and if children, they're heirs, then heirs of God, and joint heirs of Christ. Therefore, under our moral egalitarian code, all human beings are children of and heirs of God, deserving of fair and equal treatment. And that includes the women who came here last year. What does the Bible teach us to do with strangers and travelers? Quote, thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 22:21. Deuteronomy 10:19 commands, quote, love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Hebrew 13:2 reminds us, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels. Thus our moral code, under that moral code, immigrants from foreign lands are to be welcomed and entertained, not shunned and rejected. What does the Bible say about the moral and social concept of tolerance? Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Matthew 7:12. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Luke 6:37. Hence, under our moral code of conduct, we should not loathe to condemn or judge others. Such is the case with these suffering and terrified children of God, escaping the horrors of their broken and violent countries. Our moral laws tell us not to vex, nor oppress, nor judge these tired and hungry strangers and travelers. These precepts of God obligate us as moral Americans to tolerate them, to accept these frightened and destitute political refugees as human beings, created by one God, deserving our collective love, compassion, and protection. For there, but for the grace of God, go I. That is what moral law says. Let's talk about human laws. The ones behind us are actually human beings, and they like the rule of law. I like the rule of law too. So now that since I'm a lawyer, now that we know what our moral laws say, what do our man-made laws say about immigrants generally, and about refugees in particular? How many of you heard of the Latin phrase e pluribus unum? Yes. It is the original motto of the United States. It was adopted by an act of Congress in 1782. It was placed prominently on the Great Seal of the United States, which now appears on official documents such as passports. And there it remained as our national slogan until 1956. Do you know what e pluribus unum means? What does it mean? It means, it's a Latin phrase. for out of many, one, or one from many. So it's also interesting and indeed ironic to note that our first national motto, which we have proudly recited for over 150 years, was originally written in a foreign language of Latin, not in English. Out of many, one, e pluribus unum. This motto contemplates the multitudes of the people who comprise and later would become known by one name, Americans, all of us, the human beings inhabiting the land we now proudly call the United States of America. America. I also note in passing that the word America is not English. History has it that the Americas were named in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, a merchant and explorer from Florence, Italy, who first landed in the New World in 1499. A German cartographer first put the name America on a map in 1507, unaware that Columbus had landed elsewhere earlier in 1492. Thus, our country's original slogan, E pluribus unum, and our country's name, America, were born out of diversity, and yes, Latin influences, dare I say. As Americans, we are a nation of immigrants. Indeed, one of our most famous monuments, the iconic Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island, has inscribed as its base a moral call to immigrants around the world. As Mark said earlier, quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Author Emma Lazarus. Yeah! Moreover, as Americans derived from all parts of the world, we're also a country of people with high regard and deep respect for the rule of law. The rule of law. The rule of law. And so, as mentioned before, we have also become a nation of laws. And I am here to say that the human laws of our benevolent country, which are at the very foundation of our great moral society, compel us to protect, not prosecute, the terrified and desperate women and children refugees who surged at our borders in last year's humanitarian crisis of 2014.
Our social fabric, to Dean Edwards.
International law, with respect to children of the world, was once described by Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, from 1997 to 2006, and a 2001 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He said, quote, "There is no more trust sacred than the one the world holds with the children. There is no duty more important than ensuring that their rights are respected, and their welfare is protected, that their lives are free from fear and want, and they can grow up in peace." In fact, children are internationally protected under the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Under Article 4 of that treaty, of which the United States is a signatory, quote, "Governments have the responsibility to take all available measures to make sure children's rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled." And under Article 22 of the treaty, quote, "Children have the right to special protection and help if they are refugees, if they have been forced to leave their home and live in another country." That is what international law says. Moreover, under the domestic laws of the United States, all persons physically present in our blessed land, legal or illegal, have the right to due process, a under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Yes, even so-called arriving aliens and refugees have due process rights. Yes, they do. That is our law. That is our human law. Refugee children have even more protective rights under our federal statutes, regulations, and standards. For example, the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, the TVPRA, was signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. A hand for W. Bush, please. He did something right. Yeah. And that law, that Bush law, is an anti-child trafficking law which prevents the U.S. from immediately deporting unaccompanied children arriving without documentation to the U.S. in order to give them an opportunity to make a legal case for remaining here. The 2008 law requires such unaccompanied children to be released from custody to family members in the U.S. and to be served with a notice to appear in removal proceedings, where they file for such relief such as asylum. If they are not eligible for asylum, other forms of relief under our immigration laws may be applied for, such as special juvenile immigrant status, or CJIS, or a T-visa for being the victim of trafficking, or a family petition or an orphan visa if they are adopted here, or adoption under the Hague Convention, or even temporary protected status, or TPS. Whatever form of relief they apply for, these children and mothers, under the law, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, is charged with care and custody for unaccompanied minors in the U.S. And under Homeland Security Act of 2002, also another Bush law, the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for issuing those notices to appear. The U.S. Citizenship and Naturalization Service, or USCIS, formerly known as INS, has asylum officers conducting credible and reasonable fear interviews of the children and families, most without the benefit of counsel, however. Then, the Executive Office for the Immigration Review, which is part of the Department of Justice, is in charge with conducting removal and asylum hearings for these unaccompanied minors in or out of custody. Again, many children and families lack either resources or time to secure legal representation. Now, with regard to the women and adult refugees from Central America, under U.S. immigration statutes, after credible or reasonable fear interviews are conducted by asylum officers at USCIS, under INA Section 208, look it up, if they are found by an immigration judge to be a refugee, they are eligible to apply under one of the 5 categories of asylum, in most cases usually as a member of a particular social group. If they prevail before an immigration judge, they are entitled to a grant of protection against persecution. A grant of protection against persecution in their native countries. Any children who come with them gain that status derivatively.
Those people who are listening in the past, you're being used. You are being used. Think about what's with you.
Moreover, let us continue to talk about the law. Specific federal immigration regulations and standards protect children refugees. In fact, in 2004, the USCIS issued what's called the Standard of the Custody, Placement, and Care, Legal Representation, and Adjudication of Unaccompanied Alien Children in the United States. And after the TVPRA was passed by Bush, these standards were replaced and updated by a new set of standards in 2009. There are special rules for them to protect them, even in court. Accordingly, these human constitutional, statutory, and regulatory laws, by which our sacred country and its agencies are bound, obligate us as a citizenry, respective of the rule of law, to accept and protect these fleeing refugees seeking asylum, and to provide them with the minimum guarantees of due process, and to a fundamentally fair fair hearing before a neutral judge. Basically, all federal immigration laws require asylees, such as these, one fair shot to escape fear and persecution in their lands, and for a better opportunity in this great land. Now that we know what the moral, international, and United States laws say about the subject matter of which we speak, I would like to give you an update on what has happened to the children, to the women. We don't hear about it much on mainstream media. We barely hear about it on social media. But, so what happened to these women and children refugees? Has the so-called humanitarian crisis of Central American refugees ended?
No.
Were they all released from custody?
No.
Were they all deported?
Yes.
No. And it's still going on. That's what's going on with them. That is why we are here today, to cast a light on the urgent humanitarian issue, to stand in solidarity with the children against family detention, and to continue the fight for fair asylum hearings for the women and children. That's why we're here. I'd like to talk about two of the programs that have emanated from the 2014 humanitarian crisis. The first program has to do with detention, and the second immigration program has to do with deportation. They are two separate issues, believe it or not. With regard to the detention issue, the custody issue, what happened to them, where did they go, who has custody of them? Traditionally, child refugees have been afforded more protection than adults. And this is pursuant to the terms of the 1997 Flores versus Reno settlement, which relates to the government custody, placement, and care of unaccompanied alien children. This agreement, this Flores agreement, included a general government policy in favor of release from custody, and for some reason, if release cannot be effectuated, the Flores settlement says that the children should be housed in least restrictive environments. That does not mean jails, that does not mean detention centers, but that's where they ended up. The problem was that the number of Central refugees doubled in 2014. And remember, they are not illegal aliens, they are refugees. So there was more than 61,000 refugees, women and children, crossing our southern borders. In addition, 51,000 unaccompanied children. At the time of their arrival, however, there was simply no housing available, offering a least restrictive environment, as required by the Flores settlement. So, last summer, the Obama administration began authorizing larger scale detentions of women and children or families. For the first time in the United States, families were detained by the United States. But attorneys for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, argued that the women and children should remain detained with no opportunity for bond. The government justified this by arguing that the protections under the Flores settlement did not apply to the detained minors, as they were accompanied by their mothers and not technically unaccompanied alien children. Slicing words, ladies and gentlemen, slicing words, parsing words. They were also labeled, that's right, the women and children were also labeled by DHS as, quote, threats to our national security. Threats to our women and children were threats to our national security according to our U.S. government. Where does that come from? The immigration courts were often convinced by the government lawyers that detention was necessary to ensure appearance of the refugee women and children in immigration courts, as well as to deter more refugees from coming. Thus the name of the new program, Detain and Deter. Detain and deter. That's where they went. DHS lawyers, in conjunction with the immigration courts, operating under the Department of Justice, have basically concluded that indefinite family detention is an appropriate response to the 2014 humanitarian crisis in Central America. We are here to say they are wrong. The fact is, the Obama administration, responding to political pressure, began rapidly and steadily increasing the detention rates for these women and children in the summer of 2014. They had built private for-profit detention camps in Texas, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and other places. This began in June of 2014, before the Mujete event, with the opening of a temporary family detention facility in Artesia, New Mexico. The conditions at Artesia, in particular, reflected a disregard for basic refugee rights, which have been documented by the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, a member of which I am proudly a member, a group of which I am proudly a member, also by the American Civil Liberties Union, also documented abuse by the American Immigration Council, also documented rapes and abuse by the National Lawyers Guild, other attorneys. They have collectively given thousands of pro bono hours representing these detained families during numerous credible fear interviews, during asylum applications, and during bond matters. In August of 2014, Carnes Detention Center was converted from an immigration detention center for single men to one for women and their minor children. Another one cropped up in Dilley, Texas. The Dilley and Carnes family detention centers reflect the Obama administration's continuing commitment to a flawed deterrence policy toward these unaccompanied alien children and refugee families. At Dilley, a team of local and national pro bono attorneys, the University of Texas, and faith-based community members began to provide legal representation and holistic social support to these detained families. And in September of 2014, the New York Times, as well as the UN High Commission for Refugees, began to monitor court hearings of these children and women. This, coupled with a steady influx of pro bono immigration attorneys, helped to get the Artesia family detention camp closed down in December of 2014. Closed down. However, inhumane conditions persist in places like Dilley, Texas. The South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley is one of the several privately operated prisons being used by the Department of Homeland Security to house the thousands of immigrant children and families that flooded the southern borders last year. Recently, during the tour of the facility last Monday by members of Congress, U.S. Congress, hundreds of undocumented immigrant mothers and their children protested their living conditions in the detention center in Dilley, Texas. They hoisted makeshift protest signs. They chanted, "Libertad! Libertad! Liberty! Liberty!" A video taken by one of the members of Congress shows the women and children being held in the facility, chanting as a delegation of lawmakers walk towards them. Demonstrators can also be seen on the video holding up crudely written signs made from pillowcases and bed sheets. According to a source present at the protest, lawmakers who were being taken on a tour of the facility in Dilley approached the demonstrators and discussed living conditions in the facility. Human rights activists and attorneys representing immigrants detained at Dilley and similar facilities have complained not only about the living conditions in the prisons, the family prisons, but also about they are often remote. They are placed in remote locations in the middle of the desert, which makes obtaining competent legal counsel extremely difficult, to say the least. Following last Monday's visit to a similar facility, the facility in Carnes, Texas, lawmakers from the U.S. Congress called for the closure of the family detention centers. Yes, they did. Minority Whip Steny Hoyer, the second-ranking Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives, also attended the carnage trip. And here's what he said, quote, "What I saw today did nothing but confirm my belief, walking through the door, that we should end the jailing of women and children in these proceedings. It is by its nature punitive, whether it is intended to be or not." Thus, despite strong opposition by the Obama administration, and in spite of the near complete lack of resources, an army of pro bono immigration attorneys, in coordination with a coalition of volunteers and activists and church groups, and now assisted by certain members of Congress, mostly Democrats, have successfully begun to turn the political and legal tide against the zero or high bond immigration policy for the children and the families. I am glad to announce that on June 24, 2015, 5 days ago or so, the inhumane and indefinite detain and deter policy towards the Central American families and children has been modified by the DHS. Keep it up. This is what it takes. According to the memo issued 5 days ago by DHS Secretary J.C. Johnson, he has directed the ICE Director Saldana to indicate a new, watered-down version of, quote, detain and deter. The DHS Secretary has directed USCIS, which is formerly INS, to conduct credible and reasonable fear interviews within a, quote, reasonable time frame, close quote. And he's also instructed ICE to present a, quote, plan to offer release with an appropriate monetary bond or other condition of release, maybe on recognizance, to families at residential centers who are successful at stating a case of credible or reasonable fear of persecution in their home countries, close quote. In short, under the new softened up detain and deter program, because it's not gone away, family detention, according to Secretary Johnson, quote, will be short-term in most cases, close quote. Well, what does short-term mean? Johnson's memo says ICE has, quote, begun reviewing the cases of families detained beyond 90 days to evaluate whether detention during the pendency of their immigration cases is still appropriate, close quote. I say forget the 90 days and release them now. I say end family detention. I say stop detain and deter. So, my friends and colleagues, fellow Americans, the fight is not over. The women and children escaping rape and violence are being treated as criminals, not as refugees. Deter and detain is not dead, although it may be on its last legs. This is why we are still here 1 year later. There is still a great need for volunteers, pro bono lawyers for these detained refugees. There is still a need for justice and for immigration reform. There are still 1,800 people alone that are detained in Dilley, Texas. They need legal advice. They need interpreters. And they deserve to be released from custody now. Yeah! Now! So we call upon DHS to honor the Flores versus Reno settlement protocol and release all the children and families immediately to the least restrictive environment as the law provides. Moreover, I'm here to say that detaining children and families is not only inhumane and illegal and unconstitutional, but it is unnecessary and expensive. There are many programs called Alternative to Detention Programs, ADD programs. These programs include programs such as ISAT, which basically the immigrant is supervised via electronic surveillance and routine check-ins and reporting. A government study found that 95% of the persons in these out-of-custody programs appeared for their scheduled removal hearings in fiscal years 2011 through 13. So why is their detain and deter necessary? Moreover, these alternatives to detention cost the government only $10.55 a day, whereas compare it to $158 per day for detention. So why does the DHS opt for a more expensive, unnecessary program of indefinite or now short-term detention? It's wrong. It's misplaced. One last thing, I want to talk quickly about what's called the rocket dockets. The children but the children in the family detention is just half the story. The other side obstacle is the deportation trials themselves. Contrary to unfounded rumors, there's no evidence that these refugees, once released, are roaming our countries and causing havoc in our communities. There's some misleading data that say a high percentage of them have been deported in absentia. That means people didn't show up. But the problem is they didn't show up because of what's called the rocket dockets and the lack of lawyers and the lack of availability of transportation. These are kids. These are women without resources. So, I want to tell everybody, there's only a sliver of the people with final decisions that have been deported. The fact is, the vast majority of the cases started last summer are still pending and not completed. And the truth is that the government's own data shows 78.8% of the unaccompanied children, that is 2,324 children out of 25,777, have likely appeared for their first hearings in immigration court. And almost 60% of the persons in facilities, in families, that is 15,296 persons out of 25,732 people, have likely appeared for their first immigration hearings. And a majority of these cases are still going across the country. Thus, despite the government's ill-conceived policy of detain and deter, the majority of both children and families showed up for the immigration hearings. So the detention is clearly not even necessary. Now, last July, the government announced it would prioritize deportation cases for recently arrived Central Immigration children, and they started these things called the rocket dockets. And that's what another thing. What we need to make sure that our politicians know that they have to treat the children just like all the other adults. Give them the same time. Don't rock them through. Don't push them through, because they have rights just like everybody else does. In closing, I call upon all of us as moral Americans and as descendants of immigrants to spread the word on social media, to our families, to our friends, to our professors and our co-workers, but most of all, to our politicians, to end family detention. End family detention. End family detention. It violates the letter and spirit of our moral and man-made laws. It is inhumane and shameful. It is against international law and U.S. immigration law. It is immoral and wrong. It is unnecessary and too expensive. And we must do everything so we can stop it now. So we can call upon you all. Please get involved in any way you can. Thank you for coming here. Please keep informed. Please help the desperate, detained and deportable women and children. As we honor our country's 239th birthday on this July 4th, let us not demonize or rebuke the terrified children, for they are innocent and represent our future. Let us not reject the suffering women, for they are human beings and citizens of the world, seeking only security in America's bountiful bosom. Instead, let us seek to protect them as the refugees that they are, not to prosecute them as criminals. They have committed no real crimes. They are strangers and travelers, yes, but they turn themselves in at the border, asking only for due process under our immigration asylum laws. Therefore, let us show them tolerance, as the Bible teaches us. Let us seek to protect the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Release them from detention. Give them their day in court before a neutral magistrate, as the U.S. laws provide. For this is the only moral and legal way. This is the American way. God bless the women and children, and God bless the United States of America, land of liberty, freedom, and justice. Liberty, freedom, and justice. detentions. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. En family detentions. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. Sí se puede. ¿Qué queremos? Justicia. ¿Cuándo? ¿Qué queremos? Justicia. Que se acaben los centros de detención para estas familias. Cada día que pasa sin reforma de inmigración, 1,400 familias son separadas. Que eso se acabe. Queremos que eso se acabe y unidos podemos conseguirlo. Muchas gracias al señor Rubén Salazar. Creo que aprendimos mucho. Ojalá nuestros amigos, los compañeros de allá atrás se hayan callado lo suficiente para haber aprendido algo. I hope that the people that behind the yellow tape were able to shut up for a little bit, just long enough to learn something. I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker. She's the founder of National Tequila Party, right? Opposite to the Tea Party, okay? Make sure we make that clear, okay? Opposite to the Tea Party, all right? Tequila is for Hispanos, all right? She's also a co-founder of Somos Independent, all right? A dynamic person, a Chicana dedicated to our community, and also a radio host of the Chicano Radio Network in Arizona. A devoted national immigration reform activist and a friend of the migrant children from Central America. I present to you Didi Blaze Garcia.
Briefing for a second.